New videos out on JJ9 News, where we talk all things NFL all the time. The latest video involves Isaiah Rodgers getting suspended 1 year for gambling and defending himself by saying that it wasn't him who made those bets. Make sure to check the link in the description to check out that channel now. And now, on with our featured presentation. A while ago, I made a video about this game right here, Super Bowl XXXIII between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Dallas Cowboys. You can learn more about that controversy by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, to make a long story short, despite how great the game was, with many calling it the greatest Super Bowl ever at the time that it was played, with the Steelers defeating the Cowboys 35-31 in a shootout, people in Idaho were completely screwed because they were unable to watch the game. Due to a bad storm, the main power supply went out on NBC, the backup power supply went out, and the backup to the backup went out. So every single fail system and safeguard in place completely and utterly failed. There were 49 states that were able to watch the biggest annual spectacle in American television. And then, there was poor Idaho, unable to do so. But this would not be the last time that a controversy would occur involving residents in a particular state being unable to watch the Super Bowl. Heck, this would not even be the first time this happened in a Super Bowl involving the Dallas Cowboys. And heck, this would not even be the first time that this happened in a Super Bowl involving the Dallas Cowboys in a game against a team in the Eastern Time Zone in a rematch of a previous Super Bowl in a game on NBC, as specific as that might seem. Because this city right here is the city of Rutland, Vermont. Vermont is not a very big state as it is. Outside of Wyoming, Vermont is the least populated state in the United States. However, in Vermont, Rutland is one of the largest cities, with Rutland being one of the 5 most populous cities in the state. And if you occupied that city, you were completely out of luck when it came to watching Super Bowl XXVIII, due to an insane power outage and screw-up by the cable company that has to be seen to be believed. Because this is the story behind the crazy broadcasting controversy at Super Bowl XXVIII, and how Vermont residents were straight out of luck. Before I talk about the incident in question and what exactly led to this broadcasting disaster, we need some context to understand the game in question and its importance. It's January 30th, 1994, and we find ourselves down at the Georgia Dome for the first ever Super Bowl in Atlanta, in a battle between the Dallas Cowboys and the Buffalo Bills. The stakes for this one are simple, as this is the first time in Super Bowl history that the Super Bowl is a rematch of the game from the previous year, when the Cowboys slaughtered the Bills out in Pasadena at Super Bowl XXVII. The winner of this game is declared the world champion, which, if it's Buffalo, would be their first ever, and would finally put an end to all the years of heartbreak of getting to the big game and doing absolutely nothing in it. And if it's Dallas, would be their 4th ever, which would tie the most in NFL history and would be their 2nd straight. The loser of this game has their season end in heartbreaking fashion, which, if it's Buffalo, would tie the NFL record for most Super Bowl losses with 4, alongside the Denver Broncos and the Minnesota Vikings, and would mean that they did this in 4 consecutive seasons. Now, this game was actually halfway decent. Heck, this was the greatest game of all time when you compare it to the last 2 Super Bowls, which were bloodbaths. At halftime, it genuinely looked like the Bills were going to do it, and were going to win their first Super Bowl in franchise history, as they had a 13-6 lead. Then, the wheels came off the bus, as they couldn't stop Emmitt Smith. Thurman Thomas had another lackluster, turnover-prone performance at the Super Bowl, and the offense got nothing going, with the Cowboys scoring the final 24 points of the game to take it 30-13, and win what would be the 10th consecutive Super Bowl for the NFC. Still, this was a game that was not as bad as the final score might indicate. It was pretty even, and the Bills just shot themselves in the foot, with the outcome really not being in doubt until midway through the 4th quarter. It was a pretty underrated Super Bowl, all things considered, especially in the context of this game sandwiched in between 2 of the worst games of all time at Super Bowl XXVII and Super Bowl XXIX. So there's a reason that the country was glued into this game and wanted to watch it, with roughly 90 million people tuned into this game on average. However, perhaps the number could have been a bit higher for this game right here that you're watching, if it wasn't for what happened in the city of Rutland, Vermont. Now, this was a big game for the people in Rutland, not just for the obvious reason of it being the Super Bowl, but because you had some people who felt strongly about the Bills there, one way or the other. A lot of people in Rutland were fans of the New England Patriots and the New York Jets, seeing as those were the two closest teams there, and the Patriots and the Jets hate the Bills. But you did have a fair contingency of Bills fans too, seeing as Rutland borders upstate New York, and the predominant team at the time up there, especially in the 90s, was Buffalo. At least with the Idaho debacle at Super Bowl XIII, I'm not sure how many Steelers or Cowboys fans you truly had up there. Things were a little bit different when it came to Vermont and this Super Bowl. The main cable company up there was Adelphia, servicing over 10,000 people in the city, so they serviced somewhere around 60% of the people who lived in Rutland at the time. And let's just say that they were about to have quite the Super Bowl night that was anything but super. And there probably should have been some warning signs in the hour leading up to the game, even if not many people knew about it, seeing as most people were watching NBC to watch the final minutes of the pregame show and the festivities there. At 5:30 p.m., just 45 minutes before kickoff, Rutland's public access channel, Channel 15, went from showing your typical public access programming to showing the Playboy channel. And I think this should go without saying, but obviously, the type of programming you would find on a public access channel is very different from the type of content you would find on the Playboy channel, which should definitely not be viewed by kids. As one outraged father said, "My 3.5-year-old son was flipping channels to find some cartoons. He stopped at channel 15. It was something out of the rated X shelf. You could see everything. I had no idea how long my son was watching it. Of course, he's asking us now what that man is doing to the woman. He'll understand when he's older, I'll put it like that. He'll understand when he's older." Regardless, already, something was funky that night with the signal if something like that could happen. But again, I'm not sure how many people caught that gaffe. Even Bruce Nelson, the director of public access programming, had no idea what that man was talking about, saying, "I don't know what it is. I'll check into it." Adelphia got quite a few complaints about that. But when the Super Bowl started, let's just say the number of complaints absolutely skyrocketed. Because that night, there was a 50-foot piece of transmission cable from the company's tower in the city. That cable was the most important piece of cable. If that cable broke, the signal would go out. And sure enough, as you might have been able to guess, the cable broke, and the signal went out. Which meant that with the score at 3-3 after an opening drive field goal by the Cowboys and an opening drive field goal by the Bills, when the Cowboys got back on the field and were forced to punt it back to Buffalo after going 3 and out, this is what happened if you were watching the game through Adelphia.
But part of that was the push by the Buffalo line. Oh, Tasker in.
Yep, the signal went out. Now, Adelphia blamed the weather on this due to how cold it was, with the local manager for the company, Henry Poplowski, saying on this, "Things like this are going to happen. We didn't do anything wrong." And I have to note that Poplowski is right on this when he said the weather played an issue in causing the wires inside the cable to contract, which eventually led to them breaking on Super Bowl Sunday. Yes, it's going to get cold in Vermont. Yes, you have to plan for that. But January 1994 was an abnormally cold January for Vermont. Here's a look at the daily temperature from that month. The game was played on January 30th, and on January 25th, it dropped to minus 20 degrees. The day after, on January 26th, it dropped to minus 28. And the day after that, on January 27th, it dropped to minus 30. The lowest temperature for January of 1993 in Vermont, 1 year before, was minus 10 degrees. The lowest temperature for January of 1992 was minus 12 degrees. The lowest temperature for January of 1991 was minus 9 degrees. And in fact, it hadn't dipped below minus 20 degrees in January since 1981, nearly a decade and a half before this. Adelphia was founded in 1952, and I could not find a single day that had a lower temperature than minus 27 degrees in January. These 2 days in January back-to-back were some of the coldest January days on record. So yes, this was an absolutely frigid time to be in Vermont, and maybe you could say it's like blaming Phoenix for not being ready and having snowplows ready if they get hit with a blizzard, seeing as you don't expect Phoenix to get hit with a blizzard. You don't expect Rutland to have minus 30 degrees and have it for basically 3 consecutive days. However, I'm not sure anyone wants to hear we didn't do anything wrong, especially when Adelphia is providing a service that people are paying for, and said service doesn't work during the biggest television event of the year. Because for more than 2 hours, from 6:35 until 8:50 with 15 seconds left in the third quarter, there was no signal. Unless you had a dish, which not many people had, seeing as more than 10,000 televisions in the area were serviced by Adelphia, you were straight out of luck. And understandably, there was a ton of outrage about the matter. As Poplawski said, except for the sun that was out for a little while, it's been a bad day. The best part of the game, everybody missed. One viewer said, "This is the biggest boondoggle I've ever seen. When they lose the #1 show for the year, it's not good." And even though workers tried their absolute hardest to fix the issue in the cold and windy weather and darkness, trying to rig a makeshift antenna to get something, since something, no matter how snowy, was better than nothing, it was no use. It just was not any use whatsoever. For over 2 hours, so for the vast majority of the game, no one could watch. Poplawski said on what happened, the line coming from the mountain to her office, it just went dead. We had a piece of bad cable between 2 power units. We had to replace that cable to get the game back on. I'm very sorry it happened. I sincerely apologize. And what's bizarre is that this isn't even the first time that the signal went out during the Super Bowl in Rutland. Seriously, if I had a nickel for every time the signal went out during the Super Bowl in Rutland, Vermont, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. Because a quarter century before, at Super Bowl III, the signal went out for 45 minutes when a car slammed into a pole. This seems like the most cursed place to watch a Super Bowl ever. Seriously, if you live in Rutland and you're watching this, get out now if you want to watch the game. Go literally anywhere else. Your city is straight up cursed. Because even though the Cowboys defeated the Bills, not too many people in the city truly got to see the Cowboys defeat the Bills. Now, Adelphia looked into solutions for compensation, even though they didn't have to per their rules and the user agreement. The next day, Poplawski met with company officials to discuss compensating subscribers for the fact that the game was not shown, and Adelphia even bought some time on the airwaves apologizing for what happened. Per Adelphia policy, they were only required to compensate people by offering refunds or rebates if service was interrupted for 24 hours, and this was only a 2-hour interruption, so they were under no obligation to do so, even if it was the biggest 2 hours of the year for TV. Plus, as Poplawski noted, this could set a dangerous precedent. Sure, many people watched the Super Bowl, and just about every single household in Rutland that had on a TV was showing the big game. But what about another big event? What about a regular TV show? What about another sporting event? How do we quantify what is worthy of a refund for missing a big program and what isn't? Especially when, as the company noted, it wasn't their fault that the wires contracted, since it was an abnormally cold winter that had never really happened before. And that's where there was both good and bad news for subscribers. The good news was that if you called in or sent a letter, you would get a rebate. You would get compensated for the issue that took place with the broadcast of this Super Bowl that you've been watching this whole time. The bad news? The rebate was equivalent to 1 day of service. That's it. To have Adelphia costs $30 a month, so do the math, and for calling in or writing a letter, which might legitimately cost more than the rebate would give you, you received a grand total of $1. That's it. $1 whole dollar. All the food you ordered for the party that never happened. All the gas money you spent to go to a friend's place for them to not have the game. And you received $1 if you wanted. Whoop-de-doo. It's unclear how many people actually took Adelphia up on this offer, But there were a lot of people who were understandably outraged that they could not watch the Super Bowl. And I don't think this was going to make them any less outraged. I'll just put it like that. I should note that the company involved in the debacle during this Super Bowl right here, Super Bowl XXVIII, was Adelphia. And Adelphia went under in 2006, so they do not exist anymore to screw up future Super Bowls. They got caught up in a massive corruption scandal in 2002, and 4 years later, they ceased to exist, so they're no longer around anymore. And yes, this is the same Adelphia that got the naming rights to the Tennessee Titans Stadium when that opened up in 1999. Today, that stadium is known as Nissan Stadium, but back then, it was the Adelphia Coliseum, in one of the strangest naming right deals of all time, especially when you consider the fact that not many people in Tennessee even had Adelphia. Just a bizarre situation all the way around when it came to Adelphia and their sports-related endeavors. Super Bowl XXVIII was one of the most watched television programs of all time, and it's not hard to see why. Considering the popularity of the NFL, the fact that the game was actually halfway decent, and considering the chokehold that football, especially the Super Bowl, has on American culture. But that number could have been even higher if it wasn't for Adelphia and a historically bad winter in Rutland, Vermont. Because if you wanted to watch the Super Bowl in 1994, and you were in Vermont, you had anything but a super experience. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.